Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut. And I am so delighted to be hosting this evening's conversation with Julia Pistell and David Damrosch about David's new book, Around the World in 80 Books. And for all of us bibliophiles and people who love to read, this is going to be a real treat. I've spent a little bit of time talking with Julia and David in the tech runs and green room. And I can assure you we're in for a really fun conversation this evening. And I know that's what you're here for, to hear them talk, but I do have a little bit of housekeeping and other things I want to share with you before I introduce our guests. So allow me just a few minutes to do that, if you will. So first of all, thank you for jumping in on the chat and letting us know where you're from. It's been so gratifying during COVID to be running these public programs virtually and to have people from all over the world chiming in and taking part and getting to know one another. Really, we've had a lot of regulars who come to a lot of these and have kind of crafted some friendships by chatting in the chat. And do know that the program is being recorded and will reside on our website, marktwainhouse.org, once the program is complete. And the chat remains live in perpetuity. So while the program remains static after it ends, you can come back and chat and that stays lively. So please take advantage of that. However, if you have a question for the Q&A section at the end of our talk this evening, rather than post it in the chat, if you would do me the favor of putting that in the Ask a Question area that you see at the middle of the bottom of your screen there, that just helps make that portion of the program go that much more smoothly. So if you could do me that favor again, that would be a great help. And please do ask some questions. While we're down looking at that part of the screen, perhaps I could ask you to lift your eyeballs just a little tiny bit to see that long green bar that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." As I mentioned, we have been running these virtual programs since nearly the beginning of the pandemic. We were one of the very first museums to get up there and start doing our author talks virtually. We've run as many as 4 or 5 a week in some weeks, usually 2 or 3, and it has been a wild ride. It has been so much fun. We have hosted so many fascinating conversations, almost all of which have been free to register for, and we've been really pleased to be able to offer that service and that opportunity to engage throughout this difficult time. But the reality of the situation is that these programs are not free to produce. And I would just ask that if you're able and willing and want to share what you think is a fair amount of donation to help support these public programs, to keep them going, and also to support what we've done already. I just want to let you know that on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the entire staff of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny that you might share with us is put to very, very good use and is very deeply appreciated. So thank you in advance for your support and help. I'd like to draw your attention also to the link in the chat for purchasing a signed copy of David's book, Around the World in 80 Books. Now, we know that you can purchase this book elsewhere, but if you do make your purchase by clicking that link, know, first of all, that you get a signed copy, and second of all, that your purchase supports the Mark Twain House and Museum and helps us in just the way that I was just describing. So please take advantage of that opportunity to do both those things. And know again that that's much appreciated on our part. I'd really like to thank our sponsors. We're really grateful that our public programs are supported by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR, our media sponsor. They're also produced, and this one included, in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. Frank was one of our beloved trustees who passed away not too long ago, and it makes us feel really good to be able to honor his memory by producing these programs. So thank you, Frank, for being there for us. I've talked about how many programs we do offer and encourage you to visit marktwainhouse.org to see information about upcoming programs, both virtual and live. And we're really excited to be offering some live events in the next little bit right after Thanksgiving. First of all, on November 30th, we're going to be hosting our annual Mark Twain's Birthday Lecture. And this year we're honoring David Baldacci. who is one of our beloved trustees and a very staunch supporter of the museum and of Mark Twain himself, I must say. He's going to be in conversation with Michael Moran. That's a free event that's live in person at the Mark Twain House in Hartford. The next evening, December 1st, is our Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Awards ceremony. This year, we're honoring Stephen Graham Jones for his incredible novel, The Only Good Indians. Stephen's going to be in conversation with David Baldacci, who, again, is a trustee of ours, and he is the founder and benefactor of the Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award. So, again, that's live and in person. That, too, is free. Please join us if you're in the area. We'd love to have you. And the next night, we're hosting Jodi Picoult for something like, I believe, her fourth time, 3 times virtually, and maybe I'm getting it wrong. Anyway, we're delighted to have her back. And she's going to be speaking for us in person at the church across the street, Emmanuel Congregational Church. And if you haven't yet purchased your tickets, please do so right away because they're going fast. They're $30 and include a copy of her new book. So please check out the website to register for that. So having said all that, I'd like to introduce tonight's guests. Julia Pistell is an award-winning writer, comedian, and public relations professional who loves books. She was one of my predecessors at the Mark Twain House and is a very good friend of the museum. She lives here in Hartford with her husband Greg and their daughter Vega and 2 rescued cats. And she has traveled to 6 continents, which is important to the conversation we're about to have. David Damrosch, our guest of honor this evening, and the author of the book we're going to be talking about, is the chair of Harvard's Department of Comparative Literature and the founder of Harvard's Institute for World Literature. He's the author of 8 books, including The Buried Book, The Loss and Recovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh, and most recently, Comparing the Literatures, Literary Studies for a Global Age. He's given several hundred talks around the world, and his work has been translated into Arabic, Chinese, Danish, Estonian, French, and a number of other languages. His own translation of a Francophone Congolese novel, and I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce that, will be published next year, and maybe David can tell us more about that. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome to the screen Julia Pistell and David Damrosch, and please join me in giving a great big Mark Twain House and Museum welcome to the 2 of them.
Hello.
Welcome,
Hello.
David. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to sit back like everybody else and enjoy your conversation. Julia, in a little bit, will you please call me back on when you decide it's time to do Q&A?
It would be my pleasure. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you. So I'll see you in a
Jennifer.
little bit. Thank you. Have fun.
All right, David, thank you so much for doing this. On behalf of the museum, I'm so excited to be talking to you. And Twain himself was a huge traveler, a huge reader. So we'll get into that later. But I know that everyone would love to hear about the process of this wonderful book. Around the World in 80 Books isn't just it's not a simple endeavor, and I would love to hear how the project began and how COVID pushed it in a new direction, if you wouldn't mind.
Totally. So a few years ago, an editor at the Pelican Press in the London side said, might I like to do a book on world literature for a general audience? I've written for academics a lot, but I thought, well, to do it for a general audience, I need some kind of good narrative. So I thought, Around the World in 80 Books. I'm a big fan of Jules Verne. That could be a nice structure. And I planned to connect to various places I was going to go, giving talks and so on. And then COVID hit, and in rapid succession, things were canceled. I got to Oman just in March 2020, just before things shut down. But then things got canceled in Serbia and Tokyo and various. So I thought, well, I can't do it. But I thought, well, I have the books, I have a room, and why don't I just buckle down and do it? It was very, very kind of therapeutic in the midst of the pandemic. So I did it as a blog. So it's 16 weeks, 5 books a week. I gave myself the weekend off to have the sort of fiction of a weekend. Remember what those were like?
Oh, yes.
And so that was 4 months. And then it has now become the book. But the blog process was quite fascinating because for me as an academic, usually write something a year later, the press publishes it a year later, maybe it gets a couple of reviews. It's like a long process. But doing the blog, it'd be like instant. And I could get within minutes responses from Delhi and from Cairo, wherever else. And it was also more interactive. The book became much more conversational than it would have been, also more visually oriented. I talked up my publishers to having 80 illustrations for the 80 books, because we're in a visual world. I think it helps bring things to life. And also, I mean, it was quite striking. My favorite moment of the evolution of the thing, well, various things. So one of my chapters is in India. I wasn't originally going to have Tagore there, but one of my followers from Delhi says, "You're coming to India and no Tagore? How can this be?" So, so I really had a kind of a biofeedback with the group.
Yes, I was so curious about that, because since you wrote it in this order and we're kind of married to that order through your blogging, you really wrote the book in the exact order that we are reading it. So we're really along with you in your intellectual journey and as you're moving through time and space, which is so fascinating. That is not something we usually get to read, in a book off the shelf in the library.
So a little bit more bringing back to, and of course, Twain was a great self-publisher, but more like Dickens, who would serialize his novels in his magazine, and like Great Expectations, one of my books, he changed the ending because of complaints from the readers, that kind of thing. And it was a little bit, but it's very intense. I felt sort of like Penelope, that I'm weaving a story every day, then I have to take it apart and I start a fresh loom the next day. At the same time, It meant it was all in my head at once, so it became a real network weaving together, both within each chapter, each 5 books, and then across the chapters. It also sort of evolved in the moment, not only from the reader response, but it was the summer of Black Lives Matter. I didn't originally have James Baldwin or Chimamanda Adichie among my 80, though I had various other African-American writers, but they came in partly because that's what was happening, and it sort of fed in that way.
That is so fascinating. And I love that. And COVID had really changed. I'm sure everyone who's watching had a travel plan ruined by COVID. And, for so many of us, like, we're never going to get to go to some of these places. We're never going to get to visit all of them. What do we have to gain through traveling just via literature? If you never get to go to the place, what can literature bring us?
Well, that's been very important to me, partly because I'm very interested in ancient literature, and you cannot go to ancient Egypt. I mean, you can go to Egypt today, you see certain remnants of it, but you can't go there, right? And even if you go to see you can go into the pyramids, but you see things on the walls, but the literature really brings you into the minds of the people. So, like, just to take the case of Egypt, if you just see the pyramids and the temples, you think, oh, this is a death-obsessed culture. And that's what the early Orientalists thought. So they translate the sort of afterlife or the book of the dead, right? Well, but in Egyptian, it's called Sesh and Paradim Heru, which means the book of coming forth by day. And the reason they built these elaborate tombs is because they never wanted the party to end. So if you find these poems that were left inside the tombs, with titles like The Songs for Excellent Enjoyment, it gives you a sense of who they were, what was their life like. I'll read you a stanza, maybe.
Yes, please.
This is one poet that's probably about the New Kingdom, is probably 3,200 years old, give or take. So he's first talking to himself and then to his girlfriend. And he says, "Why need you hold converse with your heart? To embrace her is all my desire. As Amun lives, I come to you, my loincloth on my shoulder." And then there's another poem in the voice of the girl, or a girl. "I found my lover at the ford, his feet set on the water. He builds a table there for feasts and sets it out with beer. He brings a blush to my skin, for he is tall and lean." And I love to imagine that this is the scribe who's copying this down. He imagines he's there. Of course, scribes are normally like short and fat because they're sitting all day long. But then in the poem, he gets to be this handsome guy setting out beer in the mud of the Nile, the place of fertility itself.
Absolutely. And yeah, my loincloth on my shoulder, that is as risque as anything the Twain House has ever seen, says the comments. Although I'm sure Twain himself would have loved it.
Well, when the innocents went abroad, they were finding not so much innocence around them, even among themselves.
Exactly. So we also, while we're on the process here, we are really curious. How was this different than writing a purely academic work? What did you have in your mind as you were communicating your love of world literature and all your expertise and bringing it all together for this work?
Well, it's very different because academic work, you're normally writing for people who in some way are paid to read you. They have to read you for some reason or other, or the course, they're paying to read you. Whereas for this, you really have to reach readers and persuade them to read. And of course, I'm a preacher's kid, and I have a very evangelical sense that I want people to love these works. And I also feel it's really important that not only is kind of therapeutic in COVID times, which it was for me, and a bunch of my readers of the blog said that also, but also we're living in a world of closing borders and building walls and rising ethno-nationalism. And I just think it's so important to get outside ourselves. And literature is the most pleasurable way to do that, as well as one of the best ways to avoid what one of my authors at Chimamanda Adichie, who I mentioned, calls the danger of a single story, which is the title of a TED Talk she gave that's been watched 24 million times. It shows there's a real hunger for getting out of those singular stories. And this certainly does that. So then the choice was, well, there's a Monty Python routine called the Summarize Proust competition, where the contestants have like 30 seconds and they all fail, of course. But so if I have 1,500 words for Marcel Proust, right, he writes 3,000 pages, what am I going to do? And I also have only one day. So I have to really think about it and get it on paper before I go to the next day with another book. But it really made me think, well, what is the essence of what I want to tell a reader? The reader may have read it years ago and vaguely remembered it. The reader may very well have heard of Proust's name and never read it, or in many cases, the reader will not even have heard the name of some of these authors. So what am I going to do in 5 pages of type, 1,500 words, to really talk about what matters to me personally? It became a very personal book, and what matters in terms of the network that I'm setting up in the chapter and across chapters. A lot of my theme is that it takes a village to write a novel. It takes the world, in fact, and these writers are all in dialogue with other people in their own country and abroad. So trying to sort of show that in 1,500 words and talk about how can we get the essence of this and really bring it to life.
Yeah. So one of the methodologies that I enjoyed, intentional or not, is, you start in London, and the works that we first are introduced to are works that maybe a lot of Western readers, a lot of people who pick up this book are inclined to have read, or at least know of, right. Mrs. Dalloway, Sherlock Holmes, etc. And then it serves as a real Trojan horse. And by the time we're reading Journey to the West, a Chinese epic, that everyone should know of as a world citizen. I hate to say should, but it's really important to Chinese history and culture. Should. I was so excited. I think that there may be some trepidation or nervousness around heading deep into these translated works. And I found myself in the middle of the book, really just deep in it, from the trust of, oh yeah, I've read Sherlock Holmes. Sure, I'll go on this journey. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, introducing people to works from the Middle East or from ancient civilizations and getting folks to love them as much as you do.
This partly comes out of my teaching experience, because over these decades now, and of course I myself started teaching in antiquity, so it's been a while, students have less time to read long novels. They're too busy with so many other things. There's social media and everything else, and I don't take that lightly. I mean, they have a lot else going on. And I'm increasingly feeling that less is more. So even as much as it would be nice to assign 3,000 pages of Proust or 1,000 pages of The Tale of Genji or all 4 volumes of The Journey to the West and the big translation, it ain't going to happen. But also really giving them some selections that really open it out for you. So my utopian hope is, first of all, that the book is actually meant to be freestanding. That is, it provides a kind of meditation on what is it to read? What does literature do for us? What does it do for the writers? How does it work in the world? And then I hope also that everyone will be inspired to go read some of these books or reread some of them. My really utopian hope when I'm teaching a course is that each student unpredictably will decide they really need to learn a language they never knew they needed to learn, which happened to me more than once. When I studied Nahuatl, the Aztec language, because I was reading a translation of Aztec poetry. It was an English translation of a Spanish translation of the Nahuatl, and it just blew me away. I thought, oh, one day if I get the chance, I want to study that language. And years later in graduate school, I found it an anthropology course because literatures were not reading this stuff. And I was able to sign up, and the enrollment doubled when I signed up. But that was because of reading a really powerful translation of something I just stumbled across.
Yeah, and as we're thinking of these languages that are, fading from history, it is so important that we keep the curiosity for them alive. That is very inspiring and very utopian indeed. So within each section of each location, you choose a theme or themes emerge: imperialism, colonialism, and so many more. And I was particularly taken by how many places the writers were really defined by their traumas and their historical inequalities. So I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to what is the role of writers in really defining these historical events and translating for the rest of the world and for the future.
Yes, I really feel, and to an extent, obviously, certain themes came to the fore in the time it was being written. I mean, I ended up finding pandemic issues in more books than I expected, which was quite interesting as a metaphor or as literal things. Those come to the fore. But also, my theme all along was going to be the sort of fascination with how writers take either personal traumas or the tensions of society and then rework them into works of beauty, which is an amazing thing. Their life may be falling apart, and look, Mozart is dying and he's writing the Requiem. I mean, you would never know what's going on late in Brahms's life. I mean, from just the quality of the music. The same thing with these writers. So, yeah, it seems to me I'm particularly interested, in terms of these big historical processes. I still approach them for literature, not only as kind of good for us or as as if it was almost as good as political science or something like that. I'm drawn to works that are just compelling works of literature, and then we see how much is in them. The Roman poet Horace says that literature is supposed to be, poetry says, dulce et utile, sweet and useful. But because he's a poet, he puts the sweetness first. So, you take something like Virginia Woolf, you get all these different layers. So, and I start with Mrs. Dalloway, partly because, just go back quickly to the first part of your question, the sort of strategy for leading readers in. I did this other book for general readers called The Buried Book on the Rediscovery of the Lost Epic of Gilgamesh. That was my own little response to the First Gulf War, when I got very annoyed about this casual discourse about a clash of civilization. I thought, well, what do I know about this? Shows if you go back far enough, it's one civilization. An Epic of Gilgamesh has offshoots in Homer and in the Bible and the 1001 Nights. So I said, the general reader needs a book about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the general reader did not know that she needed a book about the Epic of Gilgamesh. So how do I do that? So for that, I use the archaeological metaphor. You start at the surface and go down into the past. So start with the Victorian era, go back. Here's the geographic version of that. You start where more people know in the Anglophone world, London, which is also where Phileas Fogg starts his journey in Jules Verne's novel. And in fact, with Mrs. Dalloway, it's very nice because I realized Phileas Fogg goes from his club to his house when he makes the bet to go around the world. Halfway across those few blocks, he passes where Clarissa Dalloway 50 years later would cross to buy her flowers for the morning, if either of them actually existed. Technically they don't, but we don't care about that.
Sure they did, Dave.
they do more than ever, right? So you have that, and you have her personal psychological issues which come up, but it's also World War I, which is coming up. There's a shell-shocked veteran, Septimus Warren Smith, who goes to see a psychiatrist, which is built on Wolfe's own unhappy experiences. And it's also this hymn to the joys of London all at once, right? So I love that mixture of things that a great work will give us.
That's so wonderful. And now let's swing in the other direction from great works. I was so delighted as someone who lives in New England, to find that Mount Desert Island gets a whole chapter in
Yeah.
this this
Well,
book.
I
That's
was
where you're
born in
from.
Bahaba. Yeah. And it was important to me. I mean, you see, I start far away from me, but then the last two chapters are where I was born and where I grew up in Maine and then in New York.
Yeah, and I love how personal these selections are. You're bringing your personal history in, but they're also very personal because there's a heavy emphasis on children's literature right at the end of the book. We've got Stuart Little, Dr. Dolittle, and Robert McCloskey, all right as you're coming in for a landing. And it struck me that all reading is ultimately a personal experience, no matter how much we're trying to connect it to a larger global conversation or academic work. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that experience of, you've gone through this long summer of reading all these books, and then you're landing on books that struck you as a child and as a person growing into this epic reader that you are today.
Yeah, very much. And it was important to me to kind of bring it home at the end. And I decided the end was better. I mean, gradually the reader gets to know a little bit. So it became a kind of a memoir of a life in reading. And then I thought, like, who's going to care at the beginning? But maybe by the end, it kind of connects for everybody to, oh, yeah, this is where reading starts. For me, one of my early childhood memories is my mother reading me a picture book, and I was so eager to be able to read it. She says, "No, you're not old enough. Wait till you're 4." And it has this sort of desire to get to that point, which I never lost. Also, then unexpectedly, as the thing built up, there were all these connections. So when I had put in Chimamanda Adichie, this fantastic Nigerian American writer, in the chapter devoted to Africa, she talked in her that TED talk about the danger of a single story, that when she's growing up in colonial Nigeria, or recently post-colonial, she's only reading imported British fiction. She starts writing stories in which children play in the snow and they eat apples. She had never seen snow. They ate mangoes. And then she finds a couple of African novels and thought, oh, there's something different. And so it wasn't any more one story. It's not that she gave up the British stories, but now she had more than one kind of way to represent childhood. And this is herself, like at age 10 or so. And the same thing was true for me, because I had this Anglophone household and we read all this British fiction. And then I suddenly discover, oh, look, so not just like Voyage of Dr. Dolittle, or Winnie the Pooh or Wind in the Willows, but E.B. White, Stuart Little, and I find, and McCloskey, One Morning in Maine, that they wrote those books within a few miles of where I was living over there. Or then even again, Sarah Orne Jewett, going back a century, fantastic, one of the great regional writers of the late 19th century, and she has these stories set in the Mount Desert region. So it really brings it home in a real way, and I think that's true for all of us. It's very important to me also to emphasize that seeing the world through literature is not only about reading Dante and Proust and Boccaccio, but it's also reading the things that turn us onto the world as children, and also detective stories. Popular fiction is as important as anything. I end with Tolkien, my last author, who's sort of bringing us back to England for the very end as Phileas Fogg returns. And that to me was a kind of transitional book between childhood reading and grown-up reading. I still read it and teach it today. I'm listening right now to the audiobook of Lord of the Rings. I'm only about 15 hours in to the 60 or 70 hours, the full audiobook, but it's amazing to actually hear it as well.
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to go there next anyway, so I'm glad you did that naturally. I was fascinated by this final landing in a very, a classic of fantasy. We've traveled through your work through so much realism and so many lives of writers, and then we're ending on this note of Tolkien, which I loved, but I would love to hear why you chose that and what you think fantasy has, what its role is in this sort of global conversation.
Well, I do think, the book as a whole, is negotiating between, let's say, Auschwitz and utopia, right? And one chapter is after Auschwitz, and one chapter is based on utopias set in Brazil, starting with Thomas More's Utopia. probably the first work of actual world literature, that is, relating to the opening up of the whole world that had never been known before, 1516 when he's writing it. So with fantasy, I think the most realistic writing is also seeing the society from askew in some way, outside or from an angle. The most fantastic writing is also about the writer's world, always. With Tolkien, I emphasize Lord of the Rings. The more I read it, the more I see. It's got really three layers that speak to me, especially. One is his experience as a soldier in World War I in the trenches, where all but one of his best friends died. And he luckily was just wounded and invalided out. So he's that. He's also a medievalist. So he's in this world that then he reintroduces. And he's also a Catholic. And it's really something that it's infused with Catholicism, even though there's no religion in Middle Earth, because he doesn't want fake religions and he doesn't want to just pretend they're already Catholics. But in fact, it's, the sin of pride is what kills Boromir. It's what destroys Saruman, or the lust for power. And it is mercy that saves Frodo and the whole thing, because he doesn't murder Gollum when it would be the just thing to do. When Gollum tries to murder him and he doesn't. So so Tolkien is interesting to me, and it closes the chapter that ends with Madeleine L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time. It was important to me because she was the first living full-time author that I ever met. Just after we moved to New York when I was 10, she had just published A Wrinkle in Time, and she happened to be a parishioner of my father's at the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection. And the book had just resurrected her career after 10 years where she couldn't publish, because what she was writing was so out there. Young adult fiction was not supposed to have Christianity plus science, plus a strong woman, a heroine. People didn't know it. She was turned down by 20 or 30 publishers. It was amazing. So there too, it's a fantasy world, but it's also built so much out of the, realism of seeing her kids, of life in the 50s, Cold War issues, they all come in. And also in her personal case, being an awkward kid who doesn't know how to belong in her school when she's growing up. That's Meg Murray right there.
I was obsessed with Madeleine L'Engle as a young girl. And I remember thinking, even at the time, like, these books are really out there. They're really, really strange, but they're magnetic at the same time.
Yeah.
And just really formative. So, of course, the Mark Twain house has a bone to pick that Mark Twain was not a stop on the journey. But
Connecticut, I could have gone. Or San Francisco. I wonder, he would, Calaveras County, right? It could have been the early Mark Twain, could have been there.
He is all over the place. And yeah, there's a lot of ways that he could have snuck in. But yeah, I was thinking about him in thinking about how to get Twain in here. He was a travel writer, quite literally, but also so many of his works contain movement. Huck Finn Down the River Through the South. Connecticut Yankee is really a time travel book. And
Knights on Bicycles.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
It's a mashup of times. Yes.
Exactly. And now that you've joined a canon of travel writers, or I don't know if you're thinking of the book in this way, but I'm wondering what writers who are traveling constantly while they're writing, where do they fit in this geography or this world story?
Of course, I had so many works that I might have had, and I had to figure some various principles. And one of them was, but that I was interested in writers who themselves are travelers or who thematized travel, and often both. Even in the case of James Baldwin, for example, who in American studies courses, he's like this quintessential American writer, but he did all of his major writing in France. And from that distance is how he could figure out what it was for him to be an American, which he couldn't figure out as a young man and sort of fled. So that's an interesting case. Olga Tokarczuk, a fantastic recent Nobel Prize winner from Poland, her book called Flights is about a heroine who keeps going around to different museums looking at body parts. It's a very interesting thing, but it's also somehow about being from a country that for so long has not had an independent existence. It does now, but for so long was part of somebody's empire, other empire, German or Russian most often. So this travel, or we have these metaphysical travels, Matsuo Bosho, Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is a beautiful, beautiful meditation on mortality and a fascination going to see poetic places that earlier poets had talked about. He writes poems, he talks about poems. And then you get James Merrill, Prose of Departure, in which he's doing a basho travelogue, going to Japan, writing about it, writing haiku. And it's also about his own mortality. He's sick with AIDS. He doesn't tell you that. He projects that onto a friend of his, but he's dealing with his own mortality very much. And again, it's traveling, and he's traveling. And Basho says at the very beginning, we are travelers through time in our brief lives. So that travel is across time, which interests me for the ancient works as well as for the contemporary ones.
I love that. This is going to be my last question, and then we're going to bring back Jennifer, who will moderate a Q&A. So that's just a heads up. Put your questions in the chat for Jennifer. Of course, there's so many works you couldn't include, and I'm wondering if you could name some for us. If you want to give us some extras, some director's cut behind the scenes. What do you wish had made it in?
Oh, yeah, I could have had a whole different set. Now, I will just say on Twain, whom I adore and always have, I was trying to emphasize mostly works out of the United States, and then it had to be Bar Harbor, New York, at the very end. Lots of other. I would have loved to have Nabokov also as a great favorite of mine, but he wasn't really a New York kind of guy. I got in Saul Bellow because Henderson and the Rain King actually wrote in New York during his younger years before he became so associated with Chicago. But other books, there's so many more. I would have loved to have. At one time I was going to have 20 chapters, so I could have more places. In Lisbon, I would have had Fernando Pessoa, fantastic writer. The Book of Disquiet is a great Penguin translation. I recommend it highly. Largely written in his room. It's really interesting. His whole life, he doesn't publish. He leaves a trunk behind with 35,000 pages of unpublished manuscript with this brilliant stuff inside it. And it just comes to life after that. Or Iceland. One of the things I work on is Icelandic, Old Norse. And I wanted to have a chapter set in the Faroe Islands, which the Faroese is Icelandic language, and could have had some Old Norse stuff, a contemporary Faroese writer. And that's the only place I've ever eaten whale blubber. It's legal to harvest whales once a year, and also seagull and also seagrass. It's amazing, the Faroe Islands. So there could have been a lot. At the end of the book, they have a little thing called the 81st book about some of the many works we could go on to.
Yes. Wow. Well, I'm sure everyone is hopelessly scribbling a long list. Very aspirational. And I think, thank you so much, David, for speaking with me. It was
Julia,
a lot
you.
of fun. And now,
My
Jennifer, if you would like to enter the stage, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm a little reluctant because I would really have just enjoyed listening to the two of you talk for another hour or so. How fascinating. And, I'm somebody like you, Julia, who reads a lot. And yet this conversation has made me feel completely illiterate and ill-read, and made me think I have to go back and just do nothing but read for whatever years remain in my life. So I'd just like to ask, one of the things I love about the book is for each of the 16 chapters, you choose 5 works, and they're generally 5 works you would never think of being in the same chapter in a book together. And how did that must have been so exhilarating for you in a way. Can you talk a little bit about making those choices and thinking about how those works would bounce off one another in the way that you present them?
Well, E.M. Forster famously says, only connect. And that,
right,
for me, as a comparatist, is what I'd like to do. And I think with literature, one thing that's, rather than, the book is not meant to make anyone feel guilty about not having read more.
I know.
But actually, in a certain way, my model for ending each section within the chapters, kind of, when you have little kids and have a birthday party, they go away with a little party bag usually. So each section should end with a little party bag for the reader.
That's delightful.
So and it's very much meant to be. Look, this is. I could myself have had different writers for every chapter as well, but I think that the way literature works for us, partly it's this network out there in the world, and partly it's the synapses in our brain. So what we read starts to resonate. And it was very much kind of a process, right? What do I think? And then the process of choosing had a lot of shifting before it finalized. Like, what works go together. But then a lot of it was discovery. Things come up like, so the first chapter of Woolf and Dickens and Conan Doyle and P.G. Wodehouse and Arnold Bennett, one of our great rivals. And I remember, oh yeah, Bennett wrote this article savaging Woolf, and Woolf replying says something mocking of Conan Doyle. And I looked that up, and the same year she wrote Dalloway, she also wrote an essay on Dickens. So it kind of weaved it all together. It was a lot of fun. And if it had been different writers, it would have been a different pattern, obviously.
And what you've just described is what part of the excitement of the book is. It almost feels like a conversation, not just between the works, but between the authors of the works. And
Which it is, yeah.
Even
if they didn't know each other, it becomes a conversation in your head because you see these connections.
Wow.
Because you'll read it through the lens of whatever's bothering you or whatever you love. You'll find those things there.
I have so many questions of my own, but I'm not going to hog the Q&A. Jamie says, does this mean that Around the World in 80 more books is in the future?
It's tempting to me. Maybe, Son of Around the World or Bride of, or how about maybe a more kind of domestic partner of the 80 books? Could be something like that. There could easily be another 80.
Well, you do. So your final chapter is the 81st book, in which you muse on possible 81st books. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, part of it is you might find from one of these chapters, oh, there was an old favorite of yours. You go back to it. Maybe then you go to look at other writers, other books by that same writer, or other connections. One of the best moments for me with in the blog version was that one of the books I talk about, which is one of the most amazing authors alive, who should get the Nobel Prize, Margaret Atwood. And I talk about her fantastic book, The Penelopiad, in this kind of island chapter that I have with Homer as a kind of theme. And this was published in a small series by a small Scottish press called Canongate. And they have myths today, and they ask various people, interesting people, to retell a classic myth. Philip Pullman tells the life of Jesus, which is pretty interesting, in a perverse kind of way. Olga Tokarczuk, who's one of my authors, tells the story of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. Very, very interesting. So anyway, here's Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad. So one of the people following the blog was an editor at a press in China. She got interested and has now commissioned Canongate translations of the entire Myth Today series, thanks to having seen the one.
Wow.
This made my day.
Oh, I would imagine. That's amazing. And I'm pretty sure that today is Margaret Atwood's birthday.
Good heavens, is it?
And
if you haven't read The Testaments, is in the history of literature, not that often that the sequel is even better than the great original. There are very few, like Cervantes. Yes, usually the sequel is a disappointment. The Testaments, written over 30 years after The Handmaid's Tale, it's amazing.
And what to be able to overcome whatever she must have been facing in terms of the enormity of what she'd already accomplished, to be able to step back
very,
and
very hard.
Write again.
Goethe didn't manage it. Lots of people don't quite manage it. Cervantes, Lewis Carroll, and he does it by inverting the earlier book, which is quite interesting. And she sort of does that too, and she gains something. It's quite extraordinary.
Right. So while we wait for the audience to come up with some more questions, I'll ask another one, which is, I'm of a certain age, and I read a lot of books. I was a reader like both of you when I was a child and grew up and did a master's degree in English and stuff. And what I'm getting at is books that I read then that I reread now seem very different to me. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that?
Yes, absolutely. My second book, Charles Dickens, was a good example for me because I first read it as a kid when I was roughly the age of little Pip, the hero. Then I studied in college when I was roughly the age of Pip at mid-story, when he goes to London as a young man with his servant called the Avenger, and very funny. And then I taught it in my 30s when I was probably roughly the age that Pip is at the end of the novel and he's writing his story. Now I'm 10 years older than Dickens when he wrote it. And each time, so now I'm reading it through a different phase of my life. But as I say there, the little party favor is that every time I open the book again, I'm back with Pip there at the beginning of his adventure.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. And I know that Julia's the mother of a young child. I'm actually a new grandmother, so I've raised children
Well,
to
I'm a new
adulthood.
grandfather. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's the best. But for instance, Stuart Little, which I read, I devoured when my grandmother gave me a copy when I was a young child, and then I read it to each of my kids. So that's 2 more times. And I have read it as an adult, and it's a whole different story every single time you read it. And
Yeah.
the same with Wrinkle in Time, just to name 2.
Well, and one of my favorite things about children's literature since becoming a parent is picture books, or anything between picture books and chapter books. You're going to read them 100 times. And so there's this active rereading and really like getting into the language and finding something new in order to not go insane in Goodnight Moon or in Robert McCloskey works. Like, we're really born to be rereaders. Children
Right.
want to reread. So the idea that you can read Middlemarch when you're 20 and you think you're cool, but that you
Right.
shouldn't read Middlemarch again is just this false idea, and how
Totally.
much of these works do we truly remember as
and,
well?
and the one advantage of growing out of childhood, if we ever do, of course, some of us never really do, but the kid wants it identical every single time. Whereas now we can enjoy seeing something different the next time. I see in the chat some question of why am I not on Twitter? I actually did get a Twitter account, but never have used it. Facebook I use more, so I'm on Facebook, which is a little bit questionable these days, but I don't use it for evil purposes. So that's also a possibility.
Thank you for addressing those questions there. I just had another thought that I was going to bring up, but I've lost it. So I'm going to, there is another question here. First of all, is a list of these 80 books available? Well, I'm going to be kind of a jerk and say, you got to buy the book to see the list of 80 books. But David, is there
is
a kinder
website?
answer?
Well, when I did the blog that had a website, the sections are all no longer there because I improved them and revised them for the book, but the itinerary is still there. So you can go on if you just Google Around the World in 80 Books and don't pick Jules Verne, you'll see that, and that's got the full list right there also. So you don't have to buy the book, which is not as canny as Orhan Pamuk, one of my authors. I talk about My Name is Red, but also a bit about his Museum of Innocence and his fantastic thing, which he published a few years ago, this great novel called The Museum of Innocence, in which the sort of structure is that the hero Kamal has lost his beloved, and constructs a museum to her memory based on all the everyday artifacts of her life. And while he was writing this novel, he renovated an old building and made it into the Museum of Innocence. So if you go to Istanbul, if you have with you a copy of the novel, there's a ticket to the museum inside, and they'll stamp it, and you get in for free.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for telling us about that.
And we didn't get to this in our conversation, but throughout your book, you do mention other ways that literature is sort of permeated into like the pop culture world. Specifically, there's a Dante's Inferno video game, and they're just great things to hear about. Yeah, I don't really have a question. I just thought that was wonderful to read about in conversation with, turn 10 pages and now we're back to the Bible, or back to Sufi poetry.
And I think that one of my general themes is that there's a vital interplay both between great literature, canonical literature, perennial masterpieces, and current literature of all sorts, and with the broader culture, if we're lucky. And so great works. I mean, Shakespeare is everywhere around the world. There are fantastic movies made in India based on Shakespeare plays, Kurosawa in Japan, but also video games. I think I take video games more seriously than some of my colleagues, because this is a way that people enter into narrative. And I think that literature professors are often the last, to get the memo that, look, people are getting narrative and poetry other places than just in Penguin Classics editions, and that's okay. And ideally, if you're teaching intelligently, you can bring people back and forth across those realms. That's another kind of travel.
Julia mentioned Middlemarch a moment ago, and it leads me to think about our shared cultural inheritance and understanding, and they're kind of touchstones. And so they're things that occur in Middlemarch that you understand about our culture and about our shared inheritance in a way that if you haven't read Middlemarch, you just don't. And they're almost like in-jokes, I would call them. Is this a theme through the works that you've selected in any way?
Certainly one of the things they talk about is the number of cases in which an author becomes intimately identified with the city and kind of becomes, if you want to know Paris, you should read Proust, or but even if you want to know Venice, read Donna Leon's Inspector Brunetti mysteries. It gives you a sense of daily life in Venice. And it's interesting that Donna Leon is an American writer, so she is herself an outsider who adopts the city for many decades. She's now in Switzerland, but was there for years and years. And it gives you the kind of dailiness of the life, seen kind of from outside in a way that perhaps even the Venetian writer won't think about.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. So Mary Lou Narowski wants to know, is there one book that you could identify that has changed your life, that did change your life?
I do start with that exact question, in fact. So now that I'll answer this, you will need to read at least the introduction to the book. When I was 15 years old, my ninth grade teacher, Miss Stats, gave me the book that changed my life. It's literally how I began. Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. And she I was just reading Tolkien and other stuff at that time. And she thought I was ready to read some really grown-up literature. And she saw I had this kind of satiric comic interest, and so here, this great 18th century novel, and I loved that it was so amazing. And I thought, well, okay, now where would I go from here? Because I didn't know anything else. And if he had said, my favorite, and Tristram Shandy is his life and opinions. He always says his opinions, and of course his opinions about literature. If he'd said his favorite books were Defoe and Chaucer, I probably would have become an English professor, like I have a beloved older brother, Leo, who is an English professor. But Tristram says, he speaks of my dear Rabelais and my dear Cervantes. I said, I don't know who those guys are, but if Tristram likes them, I should like them too. So I go out and get the Penguin Classics. I love these books. And then I thought, oh, well, now the serious responsibilities of 10th grade are approaching. What can I read? So I get the Divine Comedy, which when I bought thinking it was another satire, I soon found it wasn't quite the knee slapper I thought it was. So really, Tristram Shandy led me. So one author led me to another, but also the publisher then led me. So Tristram leads me to Cervantes and Rabelais, but then the Penguin Classics lists these other books. So then I go to Gogol and I go to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, thanks to the publisher. So there's different, and then all thanks to the teacher. These multiple sort of venues for discovering the world. I see an interesting question about defining world literature versus, I lost the beginning of the question, more local, I guess, more national.
Are you looking
representational?
Are you looking at Stuart's question?
Yes.
So I'll read, is in the context of the larger push for diversity, is this the one you're looking at?
Yeah.
Your work to define a notion of Weltliteratur is very intriguing. How do we define world? Comparative lit as something distinct from the literature of all the world. That's an interesting question, Stuart. Thank
Absolutely. No, I've been very fascinated by this, and it's something that's debated a lot in academic circles. There's two different things I would think about. One of my little polemics in my academic writing is that the study of modern literatures in universities grew up at the high watermark of 19th century nationalism. And you had the idea there was a national literature and the national language, completely different from the literature across the Rhine in the next country over. And this was simply not true. It also, that no literature has ever been developed just by itself. Even, the most local novel you'll find, if you look at it, is also participating in world literature in some way. Virginia Woolf, when she's writing Mrs. Dalloway, she's reading Chekhov in Russian, Proust in French, Euripides in Greek, and it's all suffused there. So in a certain sense, there's only, everything has a worldly aspect. And in a certain sense, also, it's very important that there are works that are grounded in a time and place. I think it's important to read works of our own time and place. And I have, a number of, Jim Adichie, for example, or indeed Baldwin or Bellow. These are, very important American writers, or Nigerian American in case of Adichie, we should read about our own culture, but also in interaction among others. I think it's very important as just ethically, as also intellectually, and also for our shared pleasure. Now, the things I treat world literature not as a whole sum of everything ever written. It's more it's works that enter into an international sphere, that become part of this broader conversation. Is to me what world literature is, often in translation or if it's a global language like English. One of my examples is Rudyard Kipling. By the time he was 25 years old, he was being published on multiple continents. Most of his audience was in America, England, South Africa, Australia, much more than India. He became a world author in English at age 25. And he knows he's writing for outsiders who have to have India explained to them, and that becomes his genius.
Mm-hmm.
I love
And there can be great books. There are great books that then don't happen to get read outside their country, and then I don't consider them that they're not world literature. Great work of Icelandic literature, a great work of Norwegian, of whatever, of American literature. Not all those works travel, in which case, to me, they remain pretty strongly within the national world, even though if you look at them, it'll turn out they're shot through with world text very, very often.
Is this, so you're an American. Do you have colleagues in other countries throughout the world who are engaging in this same kind of enterprise as you are, but from their own seats?
This is also interesting to me. So there isn't even such a thing as one world literature. There's as many different world literatures as there are places from which you see the world. It's always from where you are. And even within a world, so I'm so fascinated, it's not even one London, right? Conan Doyle's London is very different from Virginia Woolf's London, different again from P.G. Woodis's London, Arnold Bennett's London, all the more true for world literature as a whole. And so one of the things I've been interested in, and this book partly comes out of talking to people in a bunch of places. I've probably given lectures in 50 countries or so. And I started an Institute for World Literature when I came to Harvard a dozen years ago to train people more to teach beyond those boxes I got trained in. And it was important for us to not just talk the talk, but be there. So we go in rotation between Harvard and someplace in Europe and someplace in Asia, and really get around. Just to say, in terms of one or two questions, there is a Harvard X MOOC on masterpieces of world literature that I do with my friend Martin Puchner, who's a great writer on world literature also. And that, I think you can even do it for free if you don't want any kind of credit for it, or you can do it for some price. And that's got a dozen episodes, each on a masterpiece work. So, and they got there's a lot of good stuff there. And we interview Pamuk and other people like that, as well as specialists. So that can be good to check out if you want to go further in some of these in a multimedia way. Also, there was an invitation to world literature that WGBH did with the Annenberg Foundation, and you can download that for free from Annenberg. And that, again, is very well produced. I was just one of the advisors for that, but it's really good set of introductions to different world literature texts, starting with Epic of Gilgamesh and going on to Pamuk's My Name is Red.
And folks in the audience, I will try to connect with David tomorrow or so and add some links to some of those resources to our chat so that you can all have access to those. I don't want to take the time now to Google it all and add the links now, but that sounds like a lot of fun for those of us who are here tonight. I do want to draw your attention to a comment from Stuart Barnett, who had that good question just a moment ago. He says, not a question, but I just wanted to have David see that when David was a bushy-tailed young professor at Columbia, he taught a course I took. He introduced me to someone I had never heard of, P.G. Wodehouse. For that alone, and there are many other reasons, some 40 years later, I am permanently in his debt, so he had to say thank you. And thank you for that, Stuart. That's lovely to have you here tonight. So the last question we're going to take tonight is, again, from Jamie, who's been a very active participant and has very graciously just added a link to the Masterpieces of the World Literature from Harvard. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie says, if you could invite 5 authors to dinner, who would you invite? And I'm just going to tell you, you don't have to say Mark Twain.
Oh, I would invite Samuel Clemens.
Okay.
Zing!
Absolutely. Oh, and they don't have to be alive, presumably. They can still could be.
I think we're going to let you have anybody.
Although, I mean, people I'm so fascinated by, Judith Shalansky, one of my very favorite authors among the 80, has this fantastic book called Atlas of Remote Islands, 50 islands I've never been to and never will go to. It's fantastic. Olga Tokarczuk, this recent Nobel Prize winner, I mean, she's such a good writer. I got to know just by email Joka Al-Harti, this Booker Prize winner from Oman, and I'd love to have her. That's already 3. I'd probably bring up Pamuk, whom I got to know a few years ago. So that would be 4. And I think Mo Yan, the problem with Mo Yan is that he doesn't speak English. So we'd have a bit of a translator. The first meeting of my Institute for World Literature, he was a guest speaker, and the guy who was introducing said, "Oh, this is the most important writer in China." This was 2 years before he won the Nobel Prize. And Mo Yan, he gave a great response as translator. He said, "Well, if I was that important, I wouldn't be here talking to you people." This is Mo Yan's satiric, it works both against himself and against his eyes. I think he'd be great to have at dinner.
And I think when you're assembling a fantasy dinner, you don't let language be a barrier.
That's right. In the fantasy world, we have simultaneous Google Translate. It will work, right?
Right. And Julia, can you help me remember, wasn't it true, was Sam Clemens's first date with his future wife, Olivia, did they attend a Charles Dickens lecture?
That's it.
Oh,
yes.
That makes me so happy. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yep, that was their first date, a reading. Mm-hmm.
And of course, on language learning, you have his immortal essay on that awful German language where he says that a German sentence is like you dive into the English Channel and come out at the other end with the verb in your mouth.
Yeah, he's full of it. Yeah, he's full of those kinds of observations. So.
Well, but we would ideally meet at the Mark Twain house for this dinner and really have it upstairs with that billiard table where he would write. And that's my greatest envy about Mark Twain. I've always wanted to have that 1 floor size study with a billiard table in it.
Well, you've got to come for a visit. It is beautiful.
And Dave was telling me earlier he's been to the house, so we're hoping that you'll come back when it's all safe to do so.
Love to.
And Julia, will you join us, and we'll give David not the regular public tour, but the private tour. This has just been such a delight, and for those of us who love to talk about reading and books, it's been just a treat. And Julia, thank you so much for doing such a great job of preparing. Pleasure. And David, one of the things that I like to say about the Mark Twain House is that it's a writer's home and a home for writers. And I hope that you'll now count yourself among those writers who are connected and part of our family.
Delighted to.
We'd love to have you anytime, and just please stay in touch. Don't be a stranger. And we look forward to what you produce next.
And thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for the great questions, and we will see you all next time, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody in between.
Bye-bye.
Good night.